A man who had invented a revolutionary new type of guillotine was put to death by his own invention after it malfunctioned during a live demonstration in Paris. His name was Joseph Guillotine, and he was the man who truly invented the modern guillotine. Joseph was a French engineer, an inventor, who spent years working on what would become known as one of the most feared weapons in history. But before we get into that, I think it's important to mention that this is not the channel for those easily offended. So if you're watching this, then congratulations. You are now part of our community. We love you, and none of that weird stuff that happens around Independence Day over here makes any sense whatsoever. Sorry about that. Anyway, let's get into the video. Okay, so back to Joseph. He was born in 1738 in a small village in France, and eventually moved to Paris, where he became an engineer in the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Office. That's right. It's actually called the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Office. He basically worked there managing the production of gunpowder. Okay, but back to Joseph. In 1789, when he was 51, the French Revolution broke out, and many members of the French nobility were beheaded by the guillotine, which at the time was a crude, expensive, and slow process. The typical guillotine back then looked like this. It consisted of a tall, upright frame with two long side pieces, joined together at the top, and a base with wheels. A large, heavy, angulated blade was attached to the top of the frame by means of a rope pulley system, which was incredibly inefficient. These things were so slow that they could only execute around 3 people a day, which was obviously a huge problem when you're trying to deal with hundreds of enemies of the revolution. So Joseph decided to do something about it. After seeing all of these executions, he began experimenting with ways to make the guillotine more efficient, which ended up with him creating a design for an improved version that was cheaper, faster, more reliable, more portable, and less likely to break during use, which you can imagine was a big concern. Before we get into how he died from his own invention, it's important to understand how the guillotine actually works, because without that knowledge, it doesn't really make sense how someone could die from their own invention. In order to better understand how Joseph died, we first have to go through some medical school. We need to learn how the human head works. As you may already know, the brain is encased within the skull, which is connected to the rest of the body by the spinal cord. There is a hole at the bottom of the skull called the foramen magnum, which literally just means big hole. That's Latin. For you, the foramen magnum is where the spinal cord connects to the brain itself, allowing signals to be sent and received from the rest of the body. This hole, along with the spinal cord, allows us to do anything from blinking to running a marathon. Anyway, now that we understand how the brain and the skull work, we can better understand how the guillotine actually kills people. The purpose of the guillotine is to separate the brain from the spinal cord at the foramen magnum, thus cutting off blood flow to the brain while leaving the spinal cord intact. The reason this is fatal is because once the connection between the brain and the spinal cord is severe, vital signals can no longer pass through, causing the heart and lungs to stop working, resulting in death. So now that we understand how the guillotine kills, we can get back to Joseph Guillotine and how he died testing his own invention. The year is 1792. Joseph has been working on his new version of the guillotine for 3 years, which he believes will make the executioner's job easier. Now, if you remember, back in the late 18th century, being an engineer was kind of like being a general contractor today. They're involved in every aspect of the production process. So Joseph didn't actually manufacture the guillotines himself, but rather designed them, and then sold the blueprints to manufacturers who would build them according to his specification. He had come up with a much simpler way to drop the blade, which would make the whole process quicker. Rather than using a weight to drop the blade, he designed a spring-loaded mechanism that would allow the blade to drop much faster. To demonstrate his invention to the public and hopefully drum up business, he decides to set up an exhibition in a public square in Paris. Joseph and his assistant line up 2 wooden dummies and prepare to show the public what his new and improved guillotine can do. As you may have guessed, the first dummy isn't actually going to be used. It's just there to show the difference between the old and new guillotine. The second dummy, however, will be used to test the new spring-loaded mechanism. With everything set up, Joseph steps back to admire his work as the blade comes crashing down, separating the 2 halves of the skull. There is just one small problem, though. Unlike the previous guillotines, the blade on Joseph's machine is actually razor sharp, meaning instead of cleanly separating the skull, it actually cuts straight through the base, sending the top half of the skull flying through the air and landing several feet away. The bottom half falls onto Joseph's head, crushing his skull and killing him instantly. To add insult to injury, the blade landed on his face, decapitating him. Those who witnessed the accident reported that his head landed at his feet, still clutching a pair of eyeglasses in his hand. It was quite the spectacle. Obviously, the execution never should have happened in the first place. But it was probably made worse by the fact that the scaffold had been built directly in front of a printing press. So, as onlookers were watching Joseph do his demonstration, they were also able to see the printing press in action, which made newspaper reports of the incident much more detailed than they might have otherwise been. One witness said, "We saw the head fall from the machine, roll around upon the ground and end its course at his feet, holding in his right hand a pair of spectacles, which fell out of his pocket." Another eyewitness recalled the unfortunate inventor, being somewhat near-sighted, had put on his spectacles just before the fatal stroke, which, with the last spasm of his muscles, he retained till the moment his head fell from the machine. After Joseph's untimely demise, his widow took over the business and continued to sell his designs to manufacturers. In total, he is credited with inventing 16 different types of guillotines, although it seems as though he never saw the error of his ways and continued to improve upon a tool that would go on to be responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. No, even though the guillotine is no longer used in modern times, the method of execution is still used in some countries. For example, in 2014, a man was executed by lethal injection in Texas. The lethal cocktail of drugs used in this case was supposed to mimic the effects of a botched execution by guillotine, specifically one of the 3 stages of decapitation. Here's why. The idea is that the first drug would slow the heartbeat and stop the brain from receiving oxygen. Then the second drug would paralyze the muscles, including those of the lungs. And finally, the third drug would stop the brain from using oxygen. Basically, the idea is to first kill the person, then ensure that they stay dead. So, basically the same thing that happens with the guillotine, but with drugs. Sounds humane, right? Well, not exactly. Because of the botched execution by guillotine, the use of the lethal injection in Texas has been called into question. Let's take a look at the details. On April 29th, 2014, a convicted murderer named Clayton Dillian Lockett was strapped to a gurney and executed by lethal injection. As the drugs were being administered, witnesses reported that he convulsed violently, spit up blood, and foamed at the mouth. After 43 minutes, he was pronounced dead, but not before gasping for breath 10 times. It was later discovered that the drugs hadn't been properly mixed, leading to the violent reaction. The issue is brought to the attention of Dr. Robert Glatter, an emergency medicine physician at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City. He said the following: "The botched execution by lethal injection appears to mirror the pathophysiology of a botched guillotine beheading, given that both result in severe traumatic brain injury, allowing some brain function to continue despite circulatory arrest." Basically, the guy who botched the execution by lethal injection said that it looked like a botched execution by guillotine. In response to this criticism, Texas officials defended the use of lethal injection, saying it was still a more humane form of capital punishment. However, Dylan Lockett's case was far from the first instance of botched lethal injections. Since 1976, there have been 358 executions by lethal injection in the United States. At least 28 of these have shown evidence of botching. Perhaps the most infamous case was that of Rommel Broom, who was executed in Ohio in 2009. Like Clayton, he, too, showed signs of pain during the procedure and was given a second chance to have the drugs but due to the amount of time that had passed since the failed attempt, the executioner simply left him to die. After being left alone for 20 minutes, he was pronounced dead. These examples raise questions about the effectiveness and humanity of lethal injection as a method of capital punishment. Some argue that the possibility of botching raises ethical concerns, and that it's cruel, an unusual punishment to knowingly subject someone to such a risk. In contrast, others argue that lethal injection is indeed a more humane method compared to other forms of capital punishment, such as the electric chair or firing squad. But what do you think? Is lethal injection a more humane form of execution than the guillotine? Or should it be abolished altogether? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm the host. This has been our channel. And until next time, don't forget to keep on thinking.